Demand avoidance phenomena. What are the implications of it being a biopower identity? And in brackets, that's pathological or extreme demand avoidance by Richard Woods, London South Bank University PhD student. This is a test recording of the talk that I'm due to deliver to the Disability Research Forum at Sheffield Hallam University on Friday, the 18th of December 2021. Just a quick note on this: some of the slides I'll be covering very briefly and not necessarily going into detail on. That's more to save kind of time, because there's quite a lot of material in this talk for what is intended to be a half-hour talk. Yeah, so besides that, I'll kind of move on very quickly. So this is just a list of my conflicts of interest. So I've got a few. I think the kind of main one is that I earn some income from delivering training sessions on DAP. So yeah, brief overview of what's going to be happening in this talk. So we have kind of broader contexts of the kind of theory and kind of what's kind of formed the approach of this talk, before kind of setting the situation with pathological demand avoidance in the UK. I'm just going to call it PDA because it's just easier to call it that, and most people are familiar with that. I'm going to go to briefly the three other main schools of thought on PDA. Briefly talking about PDA and stigma and autism. Before going on to talk about how kind of broader kind of cultural and societal issues intersect with kind of a person being autistic, helping to kind of create kind of PDA and kind of driving demand for it. And that includes kind of problems with the special educational needs and disability kind of system. And then I'm going to be talking about how DAP is about control, essentially, and then talking about reasons why it's problematic viewing DAP as a form of autism within the kind of literature, and then just a few concluding comments about it. So yes, my perspective, I'm autistic. I do meet one of the profiles of PDA. I'm taking an approach which intrinsically reflects upon my own views and biases and my own kind of cultural values, and how they kind of help shape my views on PDA. My overall agenda as being an autistic person, a social models supporter, is for there to be kind of at least inclusive, good quality scientific methods based research and practice. I personally prefer that we take a trans-diagnostic approach to kind of mental disorders, and but yeah, that's basically. Oh, I need to be quite clear. This is my interpretation of literature. Some people might disagree with me. One of the problems with PDA is due to just a small and often quite poor quality evidence available to support any outlook. It's really just interpretation. Anything that's kind of said about it. Yeah. What the final point is just a note on terminology. I'm going to be using the term disorder quite a bit, even though I don't think autism or PDA is inherently should necessarily be inherently pathologized. And the reason for this is that kind of the disorders that are kind of described in one of the main diagnostic manuals, they're basically just social constructs because they lack any evidence to suggest they're kind of real, tangible things. They lack any evidence, any kind of biomarker evidence to suggest that they're tangible stuff. So they're essentially all abstract. They're all kind of abstractions of kind of characteristics which may be present in a person. Some disorders you could argue do not exist. You can argue other ones, there's some evidence to indicate that there is something tangible there for them. But this is kind of getting a bit of a tangent. So this disability, this is the definition for critical autism studies that I'm using that underpins this talk. So I'm particularly kind of focusing on about how the kind of biology and culture intersect to produce disability in this kind of talk. So yeah, this kind of builds on my previous talk that I gave, my first talk I gave on PDA in 2018, and it's kind of shaped by broader literature on how various stakeholders in the public are kind of controlled by the media or certain kind of stakeholders within the kind of autism community. So what this is basically saying is that often people are kind of made to be scared, made to be frightened of something, becoming kind of more highly aroused, they process information more more slowly, and tend to be more emotively. Related towards autism, it's kind of viewed as this kind of really horrible, awful thing, and that kind of just destroys people's lives, and autism needs to be fixed or saved or cured, and people kind of often sold kind of promises about how to do that. And I'd argue kind of similar things have been happening with kind of viewing PDA as part of the autism spectrum. So yeah, it's also quite problematic because like often what's said about autism can end up entering into kind of broader kind of culture, and you can kind of have an adverse impact on autistic persons. And this is kind of something that I will kind of touch upon later. So, for example, autism is viewed to be heavily male biased to it, and that so what this means is that for clinicians they can have a quite narrow stereotypical view of what autism looks like, and this can be a barrier to diagnosing autism in females. So yeah, this quote is relatively important. It's by Roy Grinker. So what this kind of talks about is like once a diagnosis takes hold and serves as the hub around with so much wealth, so many people and activities coalesce, it takes on a life of its own as an authentic and naturalized classification. This category in turn provides an incentive for manufacturing people with the diagnosis of autism whose presence and needs support this financial infrastructure. And one can argue this kind of process is happening with PDA, which I'll kind of touch upon later. This is just a broader quote that's come out more recently, and it talks about how, at least in the UK, autism stakeholders are vulnerable to being misled by parties with kind of commercial invested interest in a particular product. It's about autism ventures, but it's equally applicable to certain autism stakeholders making bold claims around PDA and earning income from PDA related activities, and there is quite a bit of money being made out of it if one pays attention. So the main discourse around PDA is that it's either called pathological demand avoidance or extreme demand avoidance, and it was originally a pervasive mental disorder, and it's also viewed as being a rare autism profile subgroup or subtype. How that's kind of viewed, I think, is they're essentially the same thing. So yeah, it's also meant to have different strategies that are different to those used in autism. So the broader literature would tell us that the criteria for PDA are unstable. The general approach is there's a general approach to reduce the number of traits associated with PDA down to those, etc., for a diagnosis. But there's no agreement over what PDA is, and how it's diagnosed in clinical practice kind of varies. Yeah, there's several different behavioural profiles in literature which are used to diagnose PDA, which kind of indicates the uncertainty around it. So this is aggregated PDA profile, which I kind of hoovered up the different traits from the other profiles in print and kind of combined them together. So PDA is on the right hand side and autism on the left hand side. So what normally happens at the moment is PDA is diagnosed as a dual diagnosis with autism, with then kind of PDA traits put onto it. Core points to point out of this is that while on the surface PDA looks similar to autism, there is quite a bit of difference. So the main bit of difference is that PDA has more restrictive and repetitive behaviours and interests, which are anxiety driven. And that does not overlap autism because anxiety is not a feature of autism. There is some people would argue that PDA has social communication issues, and theoretically that overlap autism because for PDA, the social communication issues are not meant to be caused by theory of mind deficits, while for autistic people, some autistic people have no theory of mind deficits, or they pass theory of mind tests. So there's some overlap with that bit, but also at the bottom, down the bottom here, the PDA is suggested to have some neurodevelopmental features which are kind of generic, and they're quite common in the autistic population, and they kind of overlap other kind of developmental features associated with autistic people. Because they're generic, they've been made optional because they're not meant to be helpful in diagnosing PDA. So yeah, at the moment, recently over the last 10 years, some researchers have been researching PDA from their understandings of autism. I'm going to be a bit critical of that later. There's also the fact that caregivers tend to be highly motivated to take part in research. It's also acknowledged that PDA is a culture-bound concept to the UK, and that over the last 10 years, kind of interest in it has risen sharply and it outstrips the evidence base. And that's kind of a problem because it seems to have formed a bubble, and it really shouldn't have formed a bubble. So these campaigning efforts to have PDA recognised as part of the autism spectrum can lead to is a potential source of bias. Yeah, this is what I was trying to say about reasons why it's problematic about PDA being a culture-bound construct in the UK. So, should it be a culture-bound construct in the UK? Well, no. I mean, PDA profile of PDA profile for autism supporters would probably say that PDA should be accepted globally. I would point out that if one actually engages critically with it, it's highly controversial. And independent reputable parties who are not involved in this agenda to make PDA part of the autism spectrum and are not making money out of it, tend to equally respect divergent opinion on the topic, and they have concluded that there's no evidence to suggest what PDA is or what features are associated with it. And this includes like NICE, which is basically the clinical arbiter for clinical practice in the UK. So these are quite important groups of people. Secondly, PDA has been robustly challenged for almost 2 decades. And there's kind of I would argue, quite important point that most autistic people do not want autism itself to be divided. So the fact that some autism stakeholders are trying to divide autism with PDA is pretty much undermining that the preferences of the majority of autistic persons. There's also quite important kind of ethical and potential legal ramifications for viewing PDA as being part of the autism spectrum, because many experts and quite a few studies in PDA are indicating PDA is seen outside of autism. And this kind of matters because non-autistic people with PDA would have the same rights to diagnosis research and support, such as under the UN Convention for Rights of a Child. And also kind of like professional regulatory guidelines for kind of practitioners and clinicians tend to say, like, do not discriminate against people, and that kind of service users and caregivers should be given information they may want or need. So that would include kind of controversies and divergent opinion on the topic of PDA. There's 3 of the main schools of thought for how PDA is conceptualized. So I will kind of mention those now. This diagram is basically represents that there's no consensus over what diagnostic threshold there is for PDA. So what this basically shows is that the higher the diagnostic threshold, the less people would likely to receive a PDA diagnosis. The prevalence thresholds are inversely proportional to the severity of the diagnostic threshold. What people need to know is that from wing and tail up is basically PDA is only seen in autistic people, and down around the kind of OCD or EDAQ threshold is PDA is not pervasive, and it doesn't have to be from early childhood. So this is one of the 3 other main schools of thought on PDA. So this represents PDA being this represents rebranded autism, but this diagram is from more 2019, and what it shows is that PDA is the results from the intersection of kind of childhood, kind of autism, and kind of gender, and I'll kind of be touching upon this later. Another kind of way to view PDA is that it's a pseudo syndrome. So it's not a proper disorder or a syndrome. It represents actual features from accepted kind of conditions or constructs. So this image is from Liza Nyon's thesis, and she kind of shows it having kind of features from autism, kind of anxiety, kind of hyperactivity, kind of problems in callous and emotional traits. It's just another way of showing that PDA has features from other constructs. So in particular, this one, it has features from ADHD, kind of oppositional defiant disorder, or conduct disorder, kind of some of them issues related towards trauma and anxiety can also be present for it. And it's kind of quite important that you kind of notice that PDA itself has a kind of spiky profile, and I'll be kind of talking about this later. And the last kind of main way to kind of view PDA is as a common mental disorder. So if you consider features associated with PDA, they seem to cluster outside of autism, and I would argue the research literature would kind of tend to suggest that. So what you kind of have if you kind of compare it to DSM-5 autism criteria is kind of anxiety, irritability, kind of hyperactivity, kind of problems, and kind of obsessive features in one bit, and then kind of small section of atypical social interactions. So yeah, so I'm going to quickly mention about stereotypes in autism and stigma. So if you look at the stereotypes around autism, what's noted in clinical literature for PDA is pretty much the opposite of that a lot of the time. So, for example, autistic people are meant to dislike surprises, while those with PDA are meant to like novelty. And yeah, so autistic people are meant to be often non-sociable, while for PDA they're meant to kind of be sociable and like interacting with people. And I can, for example, a lot of autistic people are meant to not make eye contact, while people with PDA are meant to make eye contact. This is why that kind of, if it's got a kind of star or asterisk kind of next to it, it's because it's a clinical feature that suggests that kind of makes it problematic viewing PDA to being part of the autism spectrum. This is just the other, it's just a table continued. So kind of so another stereotype is that autistic people like routines and structure being imposed upon them. And while if you look at the kind of PDA literature, they're meant to have a need for control. So it's kind of this is just going to point and trying to point out, and it matters from a stigma perspective. So if you look at the literature around kind of stigma and autism, autistic people tend to suffer from a lot of stigma. So they tend to be aware that there's loads of stereotypes around autism, tend to be judged kind of negatively and discriminated against by others, and this could kind of lead to kind of internalized stigma and kind of being vulnerable to kind of poor mental health and lower self-esteem. Yeah, so autistic people kind of try and manage the effects of stigma through kind of concealment, camouflaging, kind of selectively disclosure, kind of aspects about who they are, and they'll then try to kind of reframe their identity into something positive, and also kind of doing self-advocacy. And we kind of touch these points later because the kind of latter points about self-advocacy and reconstruction are kind of important to helping to explain why PDA is kind of this kind of bubble around it has kind of happened. So yeah, other aspects about it is camouflaging is known to be harmful to autistic well-being, and it's also the stereotypes around autism can directly impact who's diagnosed with autism. So we know from multiple studies that the persons most likely to not receive an autism diagnosis in the DSM-5 criteria are those who do not conform to autism stereotypes. So yeah, the problem with the PDA features kind of contradicting autism stereotypes is it makes it harder for autistic persons to escape the impact of stigma. Because normally you would challenge it by kind of by showing features that contradict the kind of stereotypes and stuff, but you can't do that because you're kind of pathologizing stereotypes with PDA as well. So how you do that is you try and turn it into positive group identity. This is kind of just kind of broader issues to kind of touch upon this. So like autistic persons are generally kind of just really poorly treated by society, and most or much autism research and practice is poor quality, and poor quality research is often associated with poor quality ethics. And I think a similar point can be made about kind of practice. So when you kind of look at identifying PDA as a construct and as an entity, it's pretty easy to do that because one, there's no feature that is specific to PDA, and kind of the questionnaire items and the kind of diagnostic tools tend to rely on caregiver reports. And the PDA features overlap so many different constructs and conditions, it's quite easy to kind of identify with a person which wants to, especially how there's like multiple different diagnostic profiles and there's multiple different diagnostic thresholds. So the signs of kind of autistic people internalizing kind of the PDA profile of autism kind of discourse. So this is seen in kind of children, young persons, and adults. Just kind of touching more upon the potential impact of stigma and just how autistic people are just generally treated poorly by society. So a lot of autistic people have mental health problems and other kind of co-occurring conditions, and like at least 70% of us will have one, at least 40% of us will have two or more. And if you look at the kind of construct which kind of describes the stress caused by a minority in a society, it's literally called minority stress, and it turns out a lot of autistic kind of mental health and tends to be due to minority stress. A way you can counter that is through positive experience in a community. So a lot of so being part of the autistic community can be a buffer against minority stress. Um, so if you strongly identify with PDA and you kind of make a strong community around it, and you make it a positive thing, it can help protect against the impacts of stigma and minority stress. And exactly what's kind of happened with PDA and it being viewed as part of a form of autism is that there is a supportive community around it within a minority of autistic persons. They've kind of some people who identify PDA are proposing the name pervasive drive for autonomy. The problem I have with this is the UK is a Western country, and Western countries tend to have a very strong neoliberal kind of culture. So we're all tend to be meant to be independent or highly independent and navigating kind of market forces and stuff. So if you're calling PDA pervasive drive for autonomy, it kind of suggests that you have no impairment, and that literally contradicts the main parts of PDA, because PDA is meant to be a debilitating thing to experience. It's meant to get in the way of you leading a normal life. Because the main trait for it is avoids ordinary demands of everyday life. So, calling PDA pervasive drive for autonomy undermines a kind of a central point, a central aspect of PDA. It literally contradicts it. Due to autistic person strongly identifying PDA and kind of reifying it, it kind of leads to kind of conflicts between kind of autistic persons and those who disagree with it or are critical of it. So there's an example of from 2018 from where Damien Milton had a defamatory petition against him to having fired from the National Autistic Society. That was quickly taken down. More recently, I've had this kind of meme used against me by the same person who kind of did the petition against Damien. So I'm not going to read it out because it's pretty horrible, and you can kind of read it for yourself. But yeah, so don't know why that's done that. Yeah. So this kind of goes on to kind of Gaussian curves and spiky profiles. So most people should be familiar with the Gaussian curve and how if you're the line underneath the peak is basically the average, but due to how I'm changing kind of terminology around it, it's what's viewed to be normal is basically the average of the peak. And so what tends to happen is people pathologize if they're kind of at the bottom left-hand side of the Gaussian curve. They're meant to view as having deficits, so to be kind of cured or eradicated, or kind of to receive interventions. The problem with this is that it's normal for most people to not meet the kind of not to most people's kind of characteristics, the profiles, somewhere else in the Gaussian curve. It's very rare for a person to have for their characteristics to always be kind of normal or to be average. So each person has a spiky profiles, but for autistic people, we tend to have an even spiky profile compared to other people. So what this means is if you take PDA itself with its own spiky profile, with it having features from other accepted kind of constructs and disorders, it's quite easy for a person for their own kind of profiles and ways of being to match up with, for their own spiky profile to match up with PDA spiky profile. So the nature of PDA itself makes it easy to identify with. What I'm trying to say from that aspect about it. Yeah, I've kind of already mentioned that, so we can move on. Yeah, we're going to move on to societal issues. So we're going to be talking about kind of the special education needs and disabilities system within kind of broader UK education system. So it's technically meant to be needs-based, but is more often kind of diagnosis-based in practice. So kind of certificate support for children and young persons is meant to be applied through educational health care plans via kind of wraparound support, and it's meant to involve the input from all stakeholders. Problem is that kind of due to how the reforms are done to the S&D system back in 2014-15ish, neoliberal market ideology is quite rampant. So it's kind of been devolved in towards local LAs, local authorities, and local NHS trusts, and it's quite fragmented and decentralised. And they've also been impacted by austerity and budget cuts. So there's also a problem with kind of many schools becoming academies that are basically independent from local authorities, and academies tend to be responsible for their own kind of admissions policies. There's also an issue with a growing number of educational health care plans being refused, and there's basically a huge variation in support for for special educational needs and disabilities across the UK. There's also more wider issues of due to austerity measures. There's a recent reduction in kind of the amount of autism support services in at least in England anyway. So what's partly happening is that autism caregivers can use PDA as a proxy to request good quality strategies. And what I'm going to show you is these are the list of PDA strategies, and they tend to be they seem to replicate good practice essentially. So they involve stuff like kind of being flexible, like having a trusted relationship with people, kind of like using humour, using like visual communication methods, having like a plan B, giving a person 2 or 3 options, kind of negotiating with them, and kind of providing a choice and being flexible and other bits and pieces. So yeah, this is just another slide on the PDA strategies if you wanted to use this version instead of the previous slide. But kind of going forward, so yeah, the PDA lecture tends to suggest that behaviourist or reinforcement-based approaches do not work with those of PDA. So this is from Elizabeth Newton's, like, who is the first person to research PDA. She kind of said that like praise, reward, and reproof and punishment are ineffective, and then behavioural approaches fail. Kind of more broadly, if you use kind of reinforcement-based approaches to kind of extinguish kind of demand avoidance behaviours, it can leave a person vulnerable for when they're kind of experiencing aversive situations. So PDA is needed to kind of protect people from receiving reinforcement-based approaches. So PDA is meant to basically protect from the use of applied behavioural analysis or positive behaviour support. Although in practice, there's one good question just how effective PDA is at providing that protection. There's also issues of how, especially in schools, which can be quite like in schools, like children always meant to do what they're told, and there's certain kind of norms which they're meant to follow. So especially out in public as well, like parents are meant to kind of punish and be kind of authoritarian over kind of children and stuff. If you give a child a PDA diagnosis and you are being advised to basically negotiate the child and give them options, be flexible, have plan Bs and stuff, it kind of provides an excuse to kind of allow the child to transgress kind of these kind of rigid kind of cultural norms. And this is why I come back to kind of this diagram by Alison Moore about how PDA can be represented the intersection between kind of childhood, kind of autism and gender. And so basically, like, PDA is being used as a proxy to allow the child to have to be able to express their views in some respects. To basic respect as a human being, you could argue. This is more an example of kind of how you can view PDA as being about control and kind of manipulating various autism stakeholders. So over the last couple of weeks, this kind of commission in America based on around the Lancet have kind of proposed a new autism called profound autism. So it's meant to be those with kind of current intellectual disabilities with an IQ of below 50 and have minimal to no kind of language, and they're meant to require like round-the-clock supervision and assistance with kind of activities of daily living. I have then issues with this kind of proposed profound autism for multiple reasons. One of them because it seems inherently covered by the DSM-5 autism criteria. So the specifiers for level of support needs to cover those kind of people, and also intellectual impairment is a specific specifier within the DSM-5 autism criteria. There seems to be an overlap with kind of using a non-autism feature to try and carve out a subgroup between kind of profound autism and PDA. So for PDA, it's anxiety, while for profound autism, it seems to be kind of IQ and kind of intelligence. Problematic, I'll go into that next, but these kind of the reasons around how it's meant to be used to control it. So for profound autism, it's the top 4. So they're argued that they have different support needs than other autistic peoples, and the same arguments made around PDA. like clinical communities should prioritise needs of this vulnerable and underserved group, and that group is often excluded from research, and research prioritised by those with high functioning autism. That kind of research should be prioritised for those with kind of profound autism. Kind of reasons put forward by Phil Christie for kind of PDA is to help with strategic planning, comparison, and research findings, enable access to certain resources, and to better understand the child. So at least a top three for the reasons from Phil Christie kind of overlaps in the reasons for having profound autism. So you can argue it's about kind of controlling autism stakeholders um, and how they can interact with certain autistic people. Like autism subgroups are problematic for multiple reasons. There were good reasons why they were removed from the DSM-5. So, and the reasons still seem to be valid. I'm not going to go into them all because I don't really have time to do that. But they're on the slides. I'm going to leave them up for a couple of seconds if anyone wants to kind of go into. There's also kind of other reasons why the language and the logic behind kind of profound autism is problematic, including there's research suggesting that high functioning autism is just a nonsensical term. And also kind of people with kind of high functioning autism tend to have quite high support needs anyway. Sorry, I'm just really skeptical of the arguments around justification of PDA based on kind of resources and allocation and recognising different support needs. This is the last slide on kind of rationales for removing subtypes are still valid. Oh, yeah. Some of the reasons for removing autism subtypes are also applicable for PDA. So it's possible. So autistic people tend to transition between different autism subtypes over lifespan, and this has kind of been noted for PDA. So people can transition into and out of PDA under the literature. So yeah, I'm going to go on and kind of show why PDA is more viewing PDA to be part of the autism spectrum is about control. So this is a brief timeline about how PDA was kind of conceptualized. So in 2003, like Newton published an article, and like the main central trait is kind of continues to resist and avoid the ordinary demands of life. And it was diagnosed, PDA was diagnosed in non-autistic persons. Yeah, so especially in the 2000s, so about 15, 20 years ago, PDA would have been diagnosed in non-autistic people, for those who, especially non-autistic children, kind of viewed as being manipulative. Within the last 10 years, there's been a kind of strong push to make PDA a form of autism and specific to autism. So within the last 10 years, there's been a move from diagnosing PDA as a standard diagnostic construct to diagnose it as a dual diagnosis with the kind of autism and PDA traits. So you kind of see that there's been some kind of evolution of how it's been viewed and applied. This is just a slide to say that autism history tells us that PDA can become much more broadly kind of conceptualized, and it can change diagnostic groupings. This is just based on a brief overview of autism history. So yeah, I'm not going to get details of this slide, but basically, if you check the DSM-5, which is one of the main diagnostic manuals, and check to see where a feature becomes kind of pathologized as part of a disorder, the threshold is actually really quite low. So if you see where it applies to the PDA literature, it's within a group which would kind of be called the rational demand avoidance group, or well, some people would call the rational demand avoidance group. I think the split between kind of rational and extreme demand avoidance is arbitrary. But yeah, so what I'm trying to say is there's good reasons within the kind of clinical literature and autism literature to suggest taking a narrow view on PDA is a bit of a folly. There's also I know from the clinical literature and from the autism research literature that taking narrow views on autism tends to be problematic. So the classic example is kind of Leo Kanner's views on autism are generally viewed as being kind of narrow compared to Asperger's, and that Kanner's views held back autism understanding by quite a bit for a few decades. There's also kind of the fact that when we were using subtypes in DSM-4, the best indicator for what subtype of person was diagnosed with was what clinic they attended. So that tells us that different clinicians are based at different clinics would often tend to diagnose certain kind of subtypes. And also, I previously mentioned that a clinician's bias can be a barrier to diagnosing autism in females. So, yeah, it's a bit of a problem taking an narrow view on autism and autism-related kind of constructs and how they kind of present. This is a point from a recent systematic review that's mentioned elsewhere previously in the PDA literature, but what this basically tells us is that mental health conditions in autism are often problematic in measuring, and that kind of co-occurring conditions often present differently in autism versus outside of autism. So what this tells us is that PDA probably presents differently in autistic persons versus non-autistic persons. So this tells us that if you're viewing PDA to be part of the autistic spectrum, to be part of the autism spectrum, is likely to lead to biased and flawed understandings of PDA, similar to kind of like Canon's own conceptualization of autism. So yeah, this is a quote by a leading kind of PDA profile of autism kind of advocate and researcher, you could say, and basically it just tells us that they disagree with not dying autism in females based on narrow and flawed kind of narrow and biased understandings of autism. I would point out that the sentiment is equally applicable to basing understandings of PDA on assuming it's a profile of autism. I should point out the clinician probably won't like me saying that, but hey ho. There's another quote from the PDA literature by kind of PDA profile of autism proponents, and what it's pointing out is that the campaigning to make PDA recognise as part of the autism spectrum is probably biasing persons' views on PDA, but at the same time, they also seem to be implying that these supporters of PDA is a form of autism, that they are the only people who know what PDA actually looks like. Which I would say is poppycock, is the polite way to say it. PDA profile autism supporters are just as biased as anyone else's. So if you take up all these kind of different factors together around how PDA should look differently outside of autism, it should be seen in non-autistic people, how the reasons for removing autism subtypes are still valid. It does seem to be favouring autism subtypes as more of a political choice than anything else. So yeah, going to go into conclusions. So yeah, PDA is being used to control autism stakeholders. Autism groups seem to be mainly a political choice. The fact that PDA profile of autism since 2010 became a culture-bound concept is predictable. We should respect autistic persons' wishes to not divide autism, and it seems inherently unwise to view PDA to be a profile of autism. And I would reiterate that non-autistic persons at PDA have the same rights as autistic persons at PDA do, and that we should be presenting balanced and accurate information on the topic. So yeah, that's in a talk. These are my contact details. So there's my main email address, my Twitter handle, and my ResearchGate profile, which has most of my research outputs on there. And these are the references. I'm only going to hover on each line for several seconds so that if you want to pause it, you can do. And this is basically in the talk. So yeah, there's 11 slides with the kind of references on. So yeah. This is the second to last slide, so yeah, it's almost done. And yeah, so this is the last slide, and I thank you for watching this video. So yeah, I hope you have enjoyed it, and I hope it was useful to you. So thank you. Bye.